When we think about Japan's history, we think of warriors, emperors, and battles. But long before swords and castles, Japan was shaped by something far more powerful: rice, not just as food, but as control, hierarchy, and survival. If you enjoy history that changes how you see the world, subscribe to Fragments of History, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. 15,000 years ago, the Japanese archipelago was home to people who would feel almost unrecognizable to anyone raised on the image of later Japan. No castles, no armies, no empires. These were the Jomon, living in a world untouched by rice. The name Jomon comes from their cord-marked pottery, among the oldest ceramic vessels ever found, reaching back more than 10,000 years. But the pottery is only the surface. What defined them was how they survived, as hunter-gatherers moving with the seasons, following food instead of growing it. Their communities were small, rarely more than a few dozen people, not because they lacked order, but because their way of life could not sustain larger crowds. A territory could only feed so many mouths through wild game, foraged plants, fish, and shellfish. When the local abundance thinned, people moved, tracking migrations, timing harvests, chasing the next reliable source of calories. That mobility shaped everything. You could not build a world of accumulation when you had to carry your world on your back. Permanent architecture made little sense if the ground beneath you was temporary. Wealth could not concentrate when most resources had to be consumed quickly, not stored. The fixed populations and rigid hierarchies that would later define Japan could not take root here, not yet. Archaeology suggests lives that were comparatively egalitarian. Burial sites show little separation in grave goods, no elite tombs, no obvious inheritance marked in gold or ritual objects, remains of housing point to dwellings of similar size and quality. The deep divide between powerful and powerless, the kind later generations would accept as normal, had not fully formed. Leadership existed, but it was situational and unstable. A skilled hunter might guide a hunt. Someone with knowledge of plants could decide what was safe to gather. An elder might judge when it was time to move. These roles were earned and temporary, not permanent authority. In a mobile world, coercion is fragile. You cannot rule people who can simply walk away. So relationships leaned on kinship and reciprocity instead of force. You shared your catch because the next day you might come back empty-handed. You helped raise a shelter because you would need hands when it was your turn. Cooperation wasn't extracted, it was exchanged. This system worked until it didn't. The Jomon adapted to the archipelago for thousands of years, building deep knowledge of forests, rivers, coasts, and seasons. They knew where animals appeared and vanished, which plants ripened when, how to use marine life as a steady foundation. In some places, especially along productive coasts, there were signs of long-term occupation, where abundant resources made a more settled rhythm possible. But there were limits that knowledge couldn't erase. Population growth remained bound to what the land and sea happened to give. In good seasons, people ate well. In lean ones, they endured hunger. There was no reliable way to stockpile against the future, no dependable surplus to carry communities through months of scarcity. A failed salmon run, a string of poor hunts, an unusually harsh winter could push a settlement towards starvation. Their mobility also narrowed what technology could become. Complex workshops are hard to sustain when you relocate. Specialized infrastructure, the kind that demands constant maintenance, doesn't thrive in a world always preparing to move. The investments that would later remake the archipelago, field preparation, irrigation, managed landscapes, were impossible in a semi-mobile society. And without stable surpluses, political complexity couldn't harden into something permanent. You cannot support administrators, professional warriors, or full-time specialists when nearly everyone must hunt, fish, or forage to keep the group alive. The social classes that would one day define Japan, warriors, bureaucrats, priests, artisans, had no space to exist because no one could afford to feed them. Even territory was different. Bands had traditional ranges, but those boundaries shifted and overlapped. Conflict happened, but it rarely became sustained warfare. Without stored food, without fixed bases, neither side could maintain fighting forces for long. People clashed at resource sites and then moved on. Land wasn't owned, it was used. This was Japan before rice. Small communities moving with the seasons, power dispersed and negotiable, wealth difficult to store, hierarchy minimal and unstable. It was a world that had endured for millennia, a rhythm so old it could feel like the natural order of human existence. The Jomon could not have imagined what was coming. They did not know that on the Asian mainland, people had already learned to cultivate grasses that produced edible seeds, plants that could be harvested in bulk and stored through time. Among them was one grain, suited to wet fields, capable of feeding more bodies, more reliably than any seasonal hunt. That grain was rice. And when it arrived in Japan, it would tear apart the Jomon world and build something harsher, heavier, and permanent in its place. The change would not be instant, it would not be gentle, but once rice farming rooted itself in the archipelago, it would reshape everything. How people lived together, how power was held, how wealth was stored, and what kind of society could finally rise from the mud. Rice cultivation reached Japan around 300 BCE, carried across the sea by migrants from the Korean peninsula. They brought more than seeds. They brought an entirely different way to organize human life. This wasn't a new food source layered onto an old world. It was a technological shift that would reframe society from the ground up. The rice they introduced was designed for wet cultivation, paddy rice grown in flooded fields. This was not a plant you could simply gather and survive on. It demanded infrastructure, irrigation to flood fields at precise moments, levees to control flow, channels to drain excess water, and carefully prepared plots that held water without collapsing into swamp. Building that system required knowledge the Jomon world had never needed. You had to understand how water moved across land, where to cut channels, how to keep flooding consistent. You needed engineering strong enough to hold back water without failure. You needed agricultural timing, when to plant, when to flood, when to drain, when to harvest. That knowledge came from the mainland, carried by people who had practiced wet rice cultivation for generations. The influence wasn't only technical. Early rice farming communities in Japan left behind material culture, pottery styles, tool designs, settlement patterns that echoed Korea and China more than Jomon traditions. This wasn't simply Jomon people learning a new trick. It was continental migrants establishing agricultural settlements inside a landscape shaped by hunter-gatherers. And the deepest change was not the grain itself. It was labor. Hunting rewarded individual skill, reflex, patience, intimate knowledge of animal behavior. Foraging depended on recognition, timing, and local memory, skills that could be practiced alone or in small groups. Rice farming demanded coordinated collective work on a scale the Jomon economy had never required. Irrigation systems took dozens of people working together for long stretches. Fields had to be cleared, leveled, bounded, and reinforced, tasks too heavy for a single family to complete alone. Maintenance never stopped, repairing flood damage, clearing channels, adjusting water flow, and the crop itself demanded synchronized planting, weeding, and harvesting within narrow windows that could not be missed. This forced a reorganization of life. You couldn't work by preference or impulse anymore. Rice followed an agricultural calendar that everyone had to obey at the same time. Plant too early, and seedlings died. Too late, and the harvest failed. Flood at the wrong moment, and the crop drowned. A community that couldn't coordinate became a community that went hungry. The calendar turned tyrannical in ways the Jomon had never known. Hunter-gatherers could adapt. If hunting was poor today, you tried tomorrow. If one area was exhausted, you shifted to another. Rice offered no such escape. It demanded attention at specific times, and neglect meant starvation months later when there was no second chance. With that came planning on a new scale. Hunter-gatherers thought in days and weeks, where to hunt next, when to move. Rice farmers had to think in seasons and years. Spring decisions determined autumn outcomes. Seed set aside after harvest became next year's survival. Channels and levees built now would shape a community's future for decades. Long-term planning created long-term obligation. If you borrowed seed rice, you weren't repaying next week. You were bound until harvest, months away. If neighbors helped build your channel, you owed labor back across an entire season. Relationships stretched forward in time, tightening into networks of debt and reciprocity that held people in place more firmly than kinship alone ever could. Mobility ended almost immediately. You cannot build irrigation systems and abandon them because conditions change. You cannot spend months preparing fields and then walk away before harvest. Choosing rice was choosing place. Once a settlement invested labor into channels, levees, and paddies, it was locked to that ground. Too much work had been poured into the soil to leave it casually. Permanence changed everything. Houses grew heavier, more substantial. Why build for movement when you no longer move? Communities expanded because fixed fields could support far more people than mobile bands. New ideas hardened into reality. The cleared field, the channel you dug, the levee you maintained, these became yours in a way a hunting range never had. For the first time, storage became both possible and essential. Rice could be dried and kept for months, even years. That was revolutionary. A good harvest meant winter security. Multiple good harvests meant reserves against future failure, and that storable surplus would become the foundation beneath every hierarchy that followed. The change was irreversible, not only technologically, but demographically. Rice supported far higher population densities than hunting and gathering ever could. A valley that might have fed 50 Jomon hunter-gatherers could sustain 500 rice farmers. Within a few generations, agricultural communities multiplied, outnumbered the remaining hunter-gatherers, and closed around them. The Jomon faced a choice that was no choice at all: adopt rice and abandon their old rhythm, or keep their traditions and be overwhelmed by populations that grew faster and controlled more dependable food. Some tried to combine hunting and gathering with limited cultivation. Most over time transitioned fully, because the pressure created by agricultural expansion made the old way of life increasingly impossible to sustain. By 100 BCE, rice farming dominated Japan's most productive regions. The transformation had taken only 2 centuries, an instant against the 10,000-year span of Jomon life. People who had once lived by movement and season were now settled, bound to land, bound to one another, bound to a calendar. They coordinated labor, accumulated surplus, and built communities that did not drift away. What they did not yet fully grasp was what these changes were making possible, something Jomon society could not produce at any scale: concentrated political power. Because once food could be stored, it could be controlled, and once it could be controlled, so could the people who depended on it. The ability to store rice rewrote the basic terms of survival. For the first time in Japan, life could be buffered from the day's outcome. You didn't need to hunt successfully today to eat tonight. You could eat from last season's harvest. That separation between labor and consumption opened a space where power could form, then harden. Whoever controlled stored rice controlled survival itself. This kind of power had no equivalent in the hunter-gatherer world. Wild game spoiled. Foraged food couldn't be stockpiled in meaningful quantities. Even territory was difficult to monopolize when people could simply move. Rice was different. It could be accumulated, guarded, and released on someone's terms, according to decisions, not immediate need or effort alone. Storage facilities became the first infrastructure of authority. At first, these stores were communal. Village granaries meant to protect everyone against bad seasons. But within a few generations, the pattern shifted. Some storehouses grew larger, stronger, more secure. Yayoi period sites reveal a visible divide: ordinary dwellings below, elevated storehouse structures above, buildings that demanded labor, planning, and control to create. Those larger storehouses signaled more than prosperity. They signaled capacity, the ability to mobilize workers, to coordinate construction, to enforce security. A family with surplus could feed laborers through long projects, keep people working when fields demanded attention elsewhere, and place guards between hunger and the grain. Stored rice didn't just sustain life, it generated more surplus by making larger undertakings possible. Then distribution became leverage. In years of weak harvests, those with reserves could decide who received support and who did not. This wasn't charity. It manufactured obligation. If rice kept your family alive through winter, the debt didn't vanish when spring arrived. It waited. It could be called in as labor during the next planting, as support in community decisions, as service when conflict demanded bodies. The social mechanics were brutally simple. When a farmer's harvest failed, options collapsed. He could starve. He could leave and try to return to hunting and gathering, an increasingly narrow escape as agricultural settlements spread. Or he could accept rice from someone with surplus and accept what came with it. Most chose the third, and in doing so they chose dependence. Dependence compounded over time. Accept rice one season, and you owe labor the next. But if your labor goes into someone else's fields, your own work suffers. The next harvest comes up short. You need help again. More rice, more obligation, more time spent working for others. In a few generations, independent farmers could slide into a life of permanent debt, their labor spoken for before they ever stepped into their own paddies. From there, taxation didn't need to be invented. It emerged. At first, it could be framed as collective responsibility. Everyone contributes rice to a leader so the community can endure emergencies. But once the flow began, it became regular, expected, enforced by custom, then by consequence. Leaders who collected rice could support specialists, craftsmen who produced better tools, warriors who protected the community, administrators who recorded contributions and tracked obligations. These specialists became Japan's first sustained non-farming classes. They ate food they didn't grow. Their time was purchased by the harvest of others. A craftsman could improve tools because he was not pulled back into the fields. A warrior could train because someone else's labor covered his meals. An administrator could keep records because he wasn't spending his days ankle-deep in mud. Specialization accelerated inequality. A farmer working a small plot could not compete with operations that commanded multiple laborers, better tools, and access to prime land. The distance between those who controlled surplus and those who lived harvest to harvest widened with each generation. Leadership changed with it. In German society, authority had been fluid, tied to skill and context, always vulnerable to being refused. In rice communities, authority began to stick. If your family controlled significant stores, you could give your children better nutrition, stronger connections, better standing. They inherited not just grain, but the web of obligations the grain had created. A child born into surplus began life already elevated, and someone born without it began already trapped. Obedience became economically rational. In hunter-gatherer bands, you followed leaders because their knowledge helped you survive, and if you disagreed, you could leave. In agricultural settlements, leaving meant abandoning fields, infrastructure, and community protection. More than that, it meant abandoning access to stored food. Challenging authority became a direct risk to your family's survival. The cost of disobedience wasn't humiliation, it was hunger. This wasn't rule through constant violence. Though violence would come, it was rule through dependency. Make people reliant on you for survival, and most demands no longer need to be shouted. The threat lives inside the relationship. Refuse to work a leader's fields, and the next time rice is distributed, your household is suddenly forgotten. Speak against authority, and your contributions become insufficient. Food dependency created political power in its purest form, the ability to shape others' actions without standing over them every day. The leader with storehouses didn't need to hold a weapon to every back. He only needed to control access to what everyone needed to live. The equation was understood. People adjusted their behavior to it, quietly, rationally, and often permanently. Rice-growing communities developed hierarchies that would have been impossible before. At the top were families with the largest stores, the best land, and the widest networks of obligation. They decided planting schedules, water distribution, collective projects, and allocation of resources. Their authority didn't depend on consensus. It was built into the grain. Below them were layers of dependence, farmers with enough land to live, but weighed down by past debts. Smaller farmers who regularly relied on distributions to survive lean seasons. Landless laborers working others' fields for rice wages, each layer bound to the one above through obligations made edible. The birth of power in Japan did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. No declaration, no crowned ruler stepping into sunlight. It emerged from the quiet logic of stored food and controlled distribution. Those who accumulated surplus gained influence. Influence helped them accumulate more surplus. Surplus widened their reach. The loop tightened until hierarchy replaced equality, and obedience became the safest choice. But rice did more than build vertical authority between leader and follower. It carved a horizontal divide between those who owned land and those who worked it, and that divide would endure. Land ownership didn't arrive as a law. It arrived as a feeling that hardened into fact. In the Jomon world, land was territory you passed through. Hunting ranges, foraging patches, seasonal camps. Mobility made ownership pointless. You used a place, then you left it behind. But rice fields were different. They demanded labor sunk into the earth, clearing, leveling, irrigation, soil improvement. Once you poured that much time into one patch of ground, the claim came naturally and stubbornly. This is mine, because I made it produce. At first, families worked the land they had cleared themselves. But as rice farming spread, population rose, and the best valleys filled, difference appeared. Some families held fertile valley bottoms with dependable water. Others were pushed onto marginal hillside plots, fields that flooded unevenly and yielded unpredictably. Land quality began to decide prosperity, and land quality was never distributed equally. Geography became the first layer of inequality. Families on prime land produced steady surpluses. They could survive bad years, store reserves, and invest in improvements. Families on weaker land lived closer to the edge. One failed harvest could mean winter hunger. Hunger meant borrowing rice from those with stores. Borrowing created obligation, and obligation over time became loss. The mechanics of dispossession were simple and brutal. A farmer whose harvest failed borrowed rice to survive, promising repayment after the next season. But if that next harvest was also thin, a common fate on marginal plots, he couldn't repay. Debt rolled forward and grew heavier. Eventually, the creditor claimed land as payment. The farmer who had once worked his own field became a tenant on it. This process didn't need conquest. It needed time. It accelerated across generations. Children could inherit not land, but debt. They worked fields their grandparents had cleared, but now they worked them for someone else and received only a share of the harvest. The slide from independent farmer to dependent peasant could happen within 2 or 3 generations through poor allocation, bad weather, or simple bad luck layered on weak soil. And once that shift happened, escape narrowed. Peasants became fixed to the land in ways that made Jomon mobility impossible. You couldn't leave and start again elsewhere. Productive land was already claimed and controlled. The old frontier, unused valleys, open ranges, was closing. Agricultural expansion had filled the lowlands. What remained was already occupied or unsuitable for rice. A trapped population formed. If you were born into a family working someone else's land, your choices were stark. Continue working for a portion of the harvest, or leave and become landless. But landless people had no secure place in an agricultural economy. They couldn't grow food. They had no collateral to borrow. They had nothing to trade except their bodies and time. Most stayed where they were, not because it was good, but because everything else was worse. Out of this, agricultural elites emerged as a distinct class. These were the families controlling the most land, commanding the most workers, producing the largest surpluses, then using those surpluses to acquire more land and more labor. They weren't necessarily the most skilled farmers. They were the ones who had accumulated resources and knew how to turn accumulation into a system. Their wealth reinforced itself. Surplus rice could be loaned to struggling farmers at interest, borrow one measure, repay 1.5 after harvest. Interest-bearing debt accelerated the transfer of resources from those who were already vulnerable to those who already had reserves. Even when loans were repaid, the interest created a steady flow upward, compounding over time. Compulsory labor followed. Working someone else's land meant more than tending crops. It meant obligations, participation in projects that strengthened the landowner's position, building and maintaining irrigation systems, constructing storage facilities, clearing new fields, repairing flood damage. The labor was voluntary only in the sense that refusal meant losing access to the land you needed to eat. The work was relentless. During planting and harvest, peasants worked from dawn to dark, 7 days a week. Between peaks, they maintained channels, met labor obligations, and tried to grow supplemental food on marginal plots to stretch inadequate rice shares. The rhythm of agricultural life became a grind that consumed nearly every usable hour. Debt turned into generational servitude. A grandfather's failed season became a grandson's lifetime burden. Families weren't bound by formal slavery, not yet, but by necessity. You stayed because the field was the only route to food, and you accepted a subordinate position because all alternatives threatened immediate ruin. Scarcity sharpened this into control. In abundant years, landowners could appear generous. Adequate shares, flexible obligations, tolerance for minor defiance. But in lean years, distribution revealed the hierarchy in its purest form. The landowner's family ate first and best. Favored workers received enough. Those who had been difficult received less. The most marginal faced hunger that turned quickly into starvation. This selective distribution enforced order more effectively than constant violence. Everyone understood the reality. Survival, in bad years, depended on staying in favor with those who controlled surplus. Obedience wasn't just practical, it was life or death arithmetic. Wealth concentration deepened with each generation. Successful families married into other successful families, consolidating prime land. They taught their children literacy and numeracy, skills peasants could not access. They built ties with other elites beyond their village, forming networks of mutual support that outlasted individual seasons and individual lives. Over time, the hierarchy hardened until it felt natural. Children born into elite households grew up inside privilege and mistook it for the proper order of the world. Children born into peasant families inherited subordination so early it seemed inevitable. The idea that land could be redistributed, that surplus could remain communal, that obligation could be reciprocal rather than one way. Those possibilities faded as the agricultural order established itself. By the end of the Yayoi period, around 300 CE, class stratification had taken root. At the top were families controlling extensive lands and commanding many workers. Beneath them were free farmers with varying degrees of independence. At the bottom were landless peasants whose labor held the structure upright, receiving little more than subsistence in return. This wasn't imposed by a conqueror's decree. It was the logic of rice agriculture made visible, the huge investment required to create fields, the unequal value of land, the power of stored surplus, and the dependency created by unequal distribution. Inequality wasn't an accident of rice cultivation. It was built into it, but inequality alone didn't explain what came next, because the land that produced rice was limited, valuable, and worth taking, and that made conflict inevitable. Violence in Jomon society had been sporadic and contained. Bands might clash over hunting ranges or dispute access to a productive stretch of coast, but conflict rarely lasted. You couldn't sustain warfare when everyone was needed to find food, and there was little material wealth worth taking. Rice changed the calculation entirely. Now there was something worth killing for, productive land shaped by generations of labor, yielding surplus year after year. A valley with fertile soil and reliable water could support hundreds of people indefinitely. That made it valuable enough to take and valuable enough to die defending. The disputes began at the edges. Adjacent communities pressed against one another, especially in river valleys where water decided everything. Who controlled the upstream sections of channels? Who could build a dam that might flood or starve the downstream fields? These weren't technical arguments. They were questions of survival. Crops succeeded or failed based on answers carved into the landscape. Early fighting was likely raids, fast, targeted attacks timed for maximum damage. Strike during harvest. Seize the rice that represented an entire year of work. You didn't need to defeat a rival in open battle. You only needed to take their stored food. A single successful raid could break a community for a year and feed another through the winter. So, protection became necessity. Communities posted guards when rice ripened, when bundles were carried to storage, when granaries held the concentrated wealth of entire seasons. These weren't professional soldiers yet, just farmers pulled away from the fields, but the shift mattered. For the first time, significant human labor was being diverted from producing food to protecting it. The Yayoi archaeological record reflects the change. Settlements drifted away from open, exposed villages toward defensible positions. Hilltop sites, ditches, palisades. Skeletal remains show more traumatic injuries consistent with organized violence. Weapons became more standardized, shaped for fighting people rather than hunting animals. Rice wasn't only the prize, it was what made fighting possible. Even small armies require supplies beyond what individuals can carry. Hunter-gatherer groups couldn't sustain campaigns because they couldn't stockpile enough food to support extended non-productive activity. Rice farming communities could. A strong harvest meant reserves that could feed warriors for weeks or months while they weren't farming. That created a feedback loop with teeth. Communities with larger surpluses could support larger forces. Larger forces could raid more effectively, capturing more rice and more productive land. Captured land and stored grain supported even larger forces, enabling more conquest. Military success became economically self-sustaining in a way rice made possible. Logistics began to matter more than bravery. A warrior's courage meant nothing if his community couldn't keep him fed in the field. The side with better food reserves could endure longer, even when tactically weaker. Sieges became thinkable. Surround a settlement and wait for stored food to run out. That kind of warfare depended entirely on surplus and storage. Commanders had to think in supplies. How much rice could fighters carry? How far could they march before needing resupply? Where could caches be placed? Which routes provided water to cook rice and sustain movement? These calculations decided what could be attacked and what could not, often more than tactics or individual skill, and the land itself became a target. Armies didn't only steal harvested rice. They burned fields, broke channels, collapsed levees, and made paddies temporarily unusable. This destruction weakened enemies economically, prevented them from feeding resistance, and created displaced populations, refugees who could be absorbed as laborers by the victors. Defeat could mean relocation. Victors claimed the productive ground while defeated communities were pushed into marginal territory. This wasn't mercy, it was a slow sentence. Poor land meant thin harvests, repeated borrowing, accumulating debts, and eventual absorption into the labor systems of stronger neighbors. War settled into the calendar. You couldn't fight during planting or harvest. Those periods demanded total labor. But between peaks, communities had time and reserves to support campaigns. Spring and autumn fighting became routine, winters for recovery, summers for intensive cultivation. Conflict stopped being an interruption. It became a season. The military role began to separate from ordinary life. Some individuals showed aptitude for combat and were supported by surplus to develop it. Others proved capable of organization, tactics, planning, command. These specialists were freed from agricultural work so they could focus on warfare, sustained by the rice others produced. Specialization sharpened violence. Full-time fighters trained more, fought better, and survived longer than seasonal farmer soldiers. Communities that maintained dedicated warriors gained an advantage that compounded over time. Victory brought resources. Resources supported more warriors brought more victory. Conflict became chronic rather than occasional. Once a community could support a standing force, that force had to justify its upkeep. Peace meant warriors consuming stored food without producing it. Leaders faced pressure, internal and external, to demonstrate strength, secure resources, and preempt rivals. War became the easiest answer, even when provocation was thin, and the psychology changed with the economy. Jomon violence was often personal, specific grievances, specific disputes. Agricultural warfare was impersonal and systematic. You attacked not because you hated your enemies, but because their valley was fertile, their surplus was stored, their labor could be controlled. The enemy was no longer only a person who wronged you, it was an economic target. Entire populations came into the calculation. Women and children, once relatively safer in hunter-gatherer conflicts, became valuable for capture. Defeated people could be turned into workers. Taking captives meant acquiring labor that would produce rice for the victors. Warfare expanded from combat between fighters into something broader, where whole communities were at stake. By around 200 CE, warfare had become a central driver of political organization. Communities formed defensive alliances, building larger units for survival. Successful military leaders gathered authority beyond their own villages. The strongest warlords controlled multiple valleys, commanded hundreds of fighters, and extracted tribute from subordinate populations. War wasn't separate from agricultural life, it was built into it. The same forces that made rice farming successful, storable surplus, concentrated valuable land, logistical capacity, made sustained conflict inevitable, sustainable, and rational. And as leaders learned that force could be used not only against neighbors, but inward, against their own people, war began to harden into something more permanent. Organized state power was taking shape. As rice farming became the foundation of life in Japan, spiritual practice shifted with it. The kami, the forces people had long recognized in the natural world, did not disappear. They were reinterpreted. More and more, they were tied to fertility, harvest, and the narrow cycles that decided whether a community ate or starved. Hunter-gatherer spirituality had revolved around animals, forests, coasts, and the unpredictable power of wild nature. The Jomon honored kami of the hunt, spirits tied to specific mountains or shorelines, forces belonging to a mobile world. Their relationship to the sacred was negotiation and respect, not constant pleading. Rice altered that relationship at its core. Now, survival depended less on skill in the moment and more on conditions no one could fully control. Rain at the right time, temperatures staying within a safe range, floods that didn't rip the fields apart, droughts that didn't stretch too long. Hunting was uncertain, but it was flexible. Farming was rigid. When the crop failed, there was no quick substitute. Agricultural life demanded cooperation from nature in a more absolute way. So the kami of cultivation moved to the center. Inari, the kami of rice and agriculture, rose in importance as communities reorganized around paddies and irrigation. Shrines dedicated to agricultural kami appeared near fields and water sources, placed where success or failure was decided. These weren't abstract ideas. They were practical attempts to influence the forces that controlled hunger. Fertility cults grew around the agricultural cycle. Spring festivals surrounded planting, with rites meant to ensure germination and early growth. Summer ceremonies asked for adequate rain and protection from flooding. Autumn harvest festivals offered thanks and sought continued favor. Winter observances marked dormancy and the hope of renewal. These were not casual celebrations. They carried desperation. A failed harvest meant death within months. Often there was no clear reason why one year prospered and the next collapsed, or why one field produced while the neighboring plot failed despite identical care. That randomness was terrifying. Religion offered a framework for making it legible and perhaps influenceable. Ritual sank into the work itself. Fields were blessed before planting. Ceremonies were performed through the growing season to encourage growth and ward off pests or sickness. At harvest, the first rice cut was offered to the kami before anyone ate. Every stage of cultivation accumulated its own spiritual requirements, treated as necessary as physical labor. Offerings accompanied major agricultural events, sometimes symbolic, sometimes material. Rice wine, salt, and prepared rice cakes were left at shrines. In some places, tools were ceremonially dedicated before use. The most serious rituals might involve animal sacrifice, though this was rarer in a society where meat was already scarce and valuable. Beneath these practices was an existential fear. Agricultural communities lived with the knowledge that failure meant hunger that turned into death. Not an abstract threat, a countdown. Hunter-gatherers had multiple food sources and mobility as options. Rice farmers had fields. When those fields failed, the world narrowed fast. Religion helped manage that anxiety. If crop failure could be explained as punishment for inadequate ritual, then success could be earned through correct observance. That was more bearable than believing outcomes were purely random, even though it introduced new pressures. The fear of doing the rituals wrong, the dread that spiritual error could trigger catastrophe. Over time, religious authority became difficult to separate from political power. Those who claimed special access to agricultural kami, who performed rites, read signs, mediated between human and divine, gained influence that reinforced emerging hierarchies. Religious specialists often came from elite families, creating a circular logic. We prosper because we honor the kami properly, and our prosperity proves we are spiritually correct. Priests and ritual leaders also controlled calendars. They declared auspicious days for planting and harvesting. That authority wasn't merely symbolic. Timing could decide whether a crop succeeded or failed. A ritual calendar could become practical control over life and death, which made spiritual authority feel undeniable. The agricultural elite used religion to legitimize inequality. A family that controlled extensive land and produced surplus could point to divine favor. The kami blessed those who performed rites correctly, who maintained proper order, who possessed spiritual merit. Those who struggled could be read as spiritually deficient, their poverty reframed as cosmic judgment rather than economic pressure. This created an ideological trap. Success proved worth, which justified accumulating more resources, which increased success. Failure suggested inadequacy, which rationalized subordinate status, which helped keep people failing. Economic outcomes became moral categories. Hierarchy began to look like the natural order of things. Shrines became centers of both spiritual and material power. Communities offered rice, labor, and goods to the kami, but those offerings were controlled by religious authorities. Successful shrines accumulated resources that could be reinvested in land, lending, and other economic activities far beyond ritual. Spiritual prestige became an engine of real accumulation. The roots of the later shrine temple complex lay here. Religious institutions became economic actors, embedded in the same networks of land, obligation, and surplus that governed secular life. A shrine might own rice fields worked by subordinate farmers, functioning economically like a major landholder while retaining spiritual authority that ordinary elites could not match. Community cohesion was enforced through participation. Collective rights demanded collective presence. Absence was visible and could be read as disrespect to the kami, an act that threatened everyone if the gods withdrew favor. No one needed to force attendance. The social and economic costs of refusal were enough. The agricultural calendar became a sacred calendar. The rhythms of planting, transplanting, weeding and harvest were marked by observances that wrapped spiritual meaning around economic necessity. You weren't just planting to eat. You were taking part in cycles that linked human work to cosmic order. That sacred framing helped make repetitive labor feel meaningful instead of merely grinding. Myths grew to explain and justify the new world. Stories of kami teaching humans to cultivate rice. Tales of divine gifts that enabled civilization. Narratives that treated surplus as an offering demanded by the universe itself. These weren't neutral stories. They made rice cultivation feel ordained rather than contingent. Social order was legitimized through religious narrative. The hierarchy of elites over subordinate laborers was presented not as exploitation, but as reflection of cosmic structure. Heaven was arranged in ranks of greater and lesser powers. Earth, by that logic, should mirror it. Resisting hierarchy became more than politically dangerous. It became spiritually transgressive. Religion had shifted from Jomon practices that honored nature's unpredictability into a system that justified inequality, reinforced obedience, and sanctified the power structures rice had created. And as communities grew larger and more complex, that sacred architecture would provide the ideological ground for what came next, something unprecedented in Japanese history, the centralized state. By the 3rd century CE, Japan's scattered agricultural communities were beginning to fuse into something larger and harder. Warfare had produced regional strongmen who controlled multiple valleys. Inequality had concentrated wealth in elite families beyond anything possible in the Jomon world. Religion had sanctified hierarchy. What remained was the mechanism that could bind these forces into a true state, administration, and rice supplied both the need for it and the fuel to sustain it. Land registration became the hinge. As territories expanded through conquest and alliance, leaders needed clarity about what they actually ruled. Which fields produced how much rice? Which villages owed what obligations? Which lands were worth defending at any cost? Personal memory and local knowledge failed once a domain stretched across dozens of communities and thousands of workers. Early records were crude. Marks on wood or bamboo tracking ownership, production and duty. But the idea was revolutionary. Material relationships could be made abstract. A sign that read, in effect, "This field yields 50 measures of rice," created administrative knowledge independent of any one person's direct experience. It could be stored, transmitted, accumulated, compared. It could outlive the people who made it. Once land could be recorded, property changed with it. Previously, control rested on occupation and recognition. You farmed this field, everyone knew it was yours, and that was enough. But conquest, displacement, and growing populations disrupted that old certainty. Written records allowed claims to travel beyond village memory. A field could be owned on paper even when faces changed, and paper, backed by authority, could be enforced across wider territory. Registration made taxation scalable. When a ruler knew what land produced, tribute could be calculated instead of negotiated. The system standardized. Fields of a certain quality owed a defined portion of harvest. Predictability followed. With predictable intake, leaders could plan how many warriors could be supported, how many laborers could be mobilized, what construction projects could be attempted without risking collapse. But regular tribute required machinery, officials to assess yields, collectors to gather rice, guards to transport it, storehouses to protect it, accountants to track it. The tribute system didn't just extract surplus, it created the first bureaucratic class, people whose full-time work was administration rather than farming or fighting. At first, the bureaucracy may have been small, trusted subordinates moving between villages, collecting tribute, reporting back. But as territories widened and obligations multiplied, administration grew with it. Record-keeping demanded training. Enforcement required authority. Officials had to be compensated, and that compensation, like everything else, came from the rice they helped extract. Central administration clustered into the first true capitals. These weren't simply large villages. They were specialized centers where power was concentrated. A ruler's residence, tribute storehouses, administrative spaces, religious centers, and military quarters gathered in one place. Within them lived people who didn't farm. Bureaucrats, craftsmen, warriors, priests, servants, populations sustained by rice taken from surrounding countryside. Early capitals were modest by later standards, perhaps only a few thousand people, but the shift was absolute. For the first time, substantial numbers lived permanently separated from food production. They ate rice they didn't grow. Their days were purchased with tribute. And those days were spent building skills and systems that deepened the state's reach. Standardization followed the same logic. As administration expanded, procedures had to match across regions. Units of measure were fixed, so tribute meant the same thing everywhere. Calendars coordinated agricultural timing beyond a single valley. Legal codes, simple at first, then increasingly elaborate, set rules for land, debt, crimes, and disputes. Uniformity replaced variation because variation was expensive to manage. Local diversity began to shrink. Different communities had developed different practices for cultivation, custom, and conflict resolution. Central authority required conformity. Regional habits were absorbed into official standards or pushed aside. What decentralization had allowed, difference, was replaced by what administration demanded, sameness. With this came population visibility. The state needed to know how many people lived within its reach for conscription, labor projects, and taxation. Household registration systems appeared, crude at first, then increasingly detailed. Families were counted, membership was recorded, obligations were written down. For the first time, entire populations became legible to an authority above the village, and legibility became control. If your existence was registered, leaving your registered place became risky. Movement required permission, re-registration, oversight. Mobility, the old escape valve of earlier worlds, tightened. People became fixed not only to land, but to administrative categories that defined their rights, their duties, and their value to the system. Fluid distinctions hardened into official status. The difference between elite and commoner, free farmer and dependent laborer, stopped being merely social reality and became documented fact. You weren't just powerful or powerless, you were recorded as such. That meant hierarchy could be enforced by law, not only by circumstance. An elite family's superiority was no longer just wealth. It was registered, recognized, protected by authority. Challenging it meant challenging the written structure of reality, backed by organized force. By the 4th century CE, the embryonic Japanese state had taken on features rice had made both possible and necessary. It was hierarchical, echoing the inequality rice created. It was bureaucratic because land, tribute, and population demanded management. It was coercive because it survived through systematic extraction, and it was militarized because compliance had to be enforced and territory had to be defended or expanded. None of this was unique to Japan. States built on grain agriculture in China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India developed similar shapes. Rice didn't cause state formation in a mystical sense. It created conditions where state-level organization became advantageous for those who could seize it. Storable surplus that fed specialists, concentrated valuable land worth fighting over, dependent populations vulnerable to control, and administrative needs that could only be met through bureaucracy. The Yamato polity that would eventually dominate much of Japan rested on these rice-based systems. The later texts that describe its rise, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, speak in emperors, battles, and mythic lineages. But beneath those narratives lay a quieter mechanism. Land registers, tribute schedules, appointments, and the steady extraction of grain that made centralized power real. This was the base of historical Japan, not the samurai, not the imperial image, not the culture later exported to outsiders. The foundation was rice, its cultivation, its control, and the state that grew from managing it. Walk into almost any Japanese home, and rice is there, not simply as food, but as a foundation. The rice cooker sits on the counter with the quiet permanence of an appliance no one questions. Meals still orbit the bowl, rice at the center, everything else arranged around it. Even the language gives it away. Gohan means cooked rice, and it also means meal. That isn't preference, it's identity embedded in daily speech. The reverence persists in ways that exceed nutrition. Wasting rice carries a weight that feels moral, not practical. Children are taught to finish every grain, told that each one holds the soul of the farmer who grew it. It isn't superstition so much as an echo, agricultural spirituality surviving intact inside ordinary manners. The symbolism reaches far past the table. Rice still stands for purity, prosperity, life. At Shinto shrines, offerings continue to include rice and rice wine, repeating gestures first made when harvests meant survival. Weddings fold rice into ritual. New Year celebrations center elaborate rice preparations, their rules and carefulness reflecting the grain's lingering sacred status. Many modern festivals still move to an agricultural rhythm, even when participants no longer recognize the origin. Spring celebrations that appear to revolve around cherry blossoms began as rice planting ceremonies. Autumn festivals persist as harvest observances, especially in rural areas, even as the agricultural context fades for urban populations. The rites remain because they have been embedded for so long that the reason no longer needs to be remembered. But the reason was rice. The language preserves the past even when people don't. Japanese holds a dense vocabulary for rice cultivation. Terms for growth stages, varieties, methods, tools, vessels, preparations. That precision wasn't ornamental. It grew out of a world where these distinctions mattered. Modern speakers use the words without needing to think about the fields that created them, but the language itself still carries the imprint. For centuries, Japan measured wealth in rice. The koku, enough rice to feed one person for a year, served as the unit of value for land, production, and status. Samurai stipends were paid in rice. Domains were described by how much rice they could produce. Taxes were assessed in rice. The economy was built on a grain you could count, store, and control. That logic outlasted the conditions that had made it inevitable. Even as Japan urbanized, industrialized, and developed monetary systems, rice retained a special economic position. Government policy continued to protect rice farming through subsidies and import restrictions long after pure economic rationality suggested cheaper alternatives. That protection isn't only about money, it's about belonging. Rice farming is treated as culturally essential in a way other crops are not. The image of paddies, green in summer, flooded and reflective in spring, still functions as an idealized national landscape, romanticized by urban populations with little direct connection to agriculture. The intensity of that attachment points back to the deeper imprint left when rice cultivation first reordered society. You can see continuity in attitudes toward land, the importance of family property, the reluctance to sell inherited ground, the emotional gravity of ancestral ties to specific places. These are echoes of the shift from temporary use to permanent ownership. Even people who have never farmed can maintain a strong attachment to family land in rural areas, preserving a relationship to property born in the rice field. Social continuity runs deeper still. The hierarchies rice cultivation created did not evaporate when the economy changed. The emphasis on group harmony over individual expression, the comfort with clear status differences, the expectation that subordinates should defer to authority. These patterns formed in a world where coordinated labor was necessary and dependency was built into survival. Modern Japan is economically transformed. The habits of the older order remain. National identity, too, is tied to rice in ways that can feel almost mystical from the outside. Being Japanese is often understood as knowing rice, how to prepare it, how to judge it, how to respect it. This isn't imposed nationalism. It's an identity that grew organically across centuries when rice cultivation and civilization became nearly synonymous. That buried foundation becomes visible when policy debates turn strangely emotional. Why maintain expensive subsidies when importing would be cheaper? Why resist agricultural liberalization that might benefit consumers? The answers rarely stay economic for long. Rice isn't treated as a commodity alone. It's treated as a cultural base, something whose protection is understood as protecting Japan itself. Education reinforces that continuity. Students learn rice cultivation in ways that exceed practical agriculture, visiting paddies, planting or harvesting, learning the calendar, absorbing the cultural practices attached to the grain. Even without a future in farming, each generation is taught to recognize rice as more than food. The landscape holds the older system in place. Rural regions are still dominated by paddies cultivated for centuries. Irrigation networks cut through valleys as living infrastructure maintained across time. Settlement patterns, villages placed in relation to arable land, roads tracing the edges of field systems, reflect decisions made when rice first established itself as the center of life. Urban space carries subtler traces. Shrines and temples often sit where farming communities could reach them, oriented toward the fields they were meant to protect, placed near water sources that once mattered for irrigation. Cities that grew around these religious centers preserved spatial relationships born in the rice economy. Even climate policy debates reveal the imprint. Predictions about climate change and rice cultivation draw attention that can surprise outsiders, given rice's modern economic share. But the concern isn't only economic. It reflects an understanding, sometimes explicit, often unspoken, that rice is a cultural practice and that its disruption would feel like an existential fracture. None of this requires conscious remembering. Most people aren't thinking about yayoi transformations when they eat rice or attend festivals. That is precisely why the continuity holds. It isn't performed tradition, it's lived habit, embedded so deeply it feels natural rather than historical. 2,000 years after rice reshaped Japan, turning mobile bands into settled communities, surplus into hierarchy, tribute into state power, the grain still shapes how people eat, celebrate, organize socially, and imagine themselves. The power rice made possible, control through food access, inequality through land, governance through extraction, doesn't vanish when it becomes familiar. It becomes invisible, and what is invisible is often what controls the longest. Japan was not built by the sword alone. It was built by the control of food, land, and survival. Before warriors ruled Japan, rice did. What do you think truly builds civilizations? Weapons or food? Comment below.